With this lecture, we're officially moving into Unit 3 of the course, which is when we're going to zoom out and talk about some bigger picture issues that have occurred in the progression of video game research over time. And so in Unit 2, we had talked about very specific methodological issues that occur within studies when we're trying to examine the relationship between video games and some outcome, in those cases, violent video games and aggression. And now we're going to look at how those minor issues that occur within studies can lead to bigger picture issues in how research progresses over time. And we're going to talk specifically about the replication crisis. So the replication crisis is a broader issue that has occurred in the fields of psychology and in related fields like communication over the last decade, which has been this recognition that many classic findings in psychological research have failed to replicate when older studies are conducted again. So when we've tried to examine whether these classic findings hold up upon replication or redoing the study, we found that many of those findings actually don't replicate. And violent video game research is one example, and it's one example that we've been looking at throughout the semester. So classic studies have sort of suggested that violent video games cause an increase in aggressive behavior. And in Unit 1 of the course, we looked at a bunch of these studies, showing that playing violent video games would increase aggression on various types of different measures, including that competitive reaction time task. But as we saw in Unit 2, more recent research has started to call this into question, given conflicting studies or studies that have drawn conflicting results, that in particular studies that have stronger internal and external validity. And this is an issue that more broadly applies to the replication crisis in psychology, because early studies were not as held up to the same kinds of standards that we now have today. So earlier studies often lacked the kind of internal and external validity that we now really seek in research when we do it nowadays. And so as we have started trying to replicate early research with these studies that have higher internal and external validity, we're starting to find that those studies actually don't replicate, that we actually get conflicting results or null results. And it's starting to basically call into question the sort of evidence base we have in these fields of which studies kind of hold up to deeper scrutiny and which ones don't. And that's not to say that no findings hold up. It's just to say that many findings, many more than we'd sort of like, have sort of failed to hold up. And violent video games is this one example where we're starting to get this sort of mixed evidence base. And one reason for this issue in the replication crisis it emerges because of how we tend to publish research in academia. And so this is probably a process that's really unfamiliar to most of you as students, and it's one that was really unfamiliar to me until really late in grad school when I really started trying to publish academic papers on studies that I had done. And so I want to walk you through what that peer review process looks like, and then I want to talk about the issues that arise because of it. And so the process itself probably doesn't seem too problematic. And so here's what happens. Once you've done a study as a researcher, you're going to write up a manuscript about that study, and you're going to submit that manuscript to a scientific journal. And scientific journals are the types of journals you've been looking at this semester when you've been pulling up experimental research for yourself. And specific outlets that want to publish scientific research. So it's not like popular press newspapers or popular press books. It's particular outlets that are for this kind of research. And once it's submitted to that journal, an editor who works at that journal is going to review the paper. And they're going to make an initial decision to say, yeah, this looks like a pretty good paper. It's up to snuff. I'm going to send this out and see what other researchers think about it. Or they're going to say, no, this paper is riddled with issues. It's not good enough for this journal. I'm going to reject it outright. And if they reject it outright, then it's not going to sort of see the light of day, at least at that journal. But if they do think that there's some merit to the paper, they're going to send that paper to 2 or 3 peer reviewers who are going to assess the quality of the study. And these reviewers are other researchers that are likely in the same field or a related field that study similar topics and have expertise on that particular paper. And so they're going to send it to 2 to 3 reviewers who are going to read the paper and assess its quality. They're going to decide what they think. And they're basically going to provide a recommendation to the editor, and there's one of 3 general kinds of recommendations that they might offer. They might say, this paper is great, you should accept it right now, you should publish it, I love it. They might say, no, actually, there's lots of issues with this paper, you should not publish it, you should reject it. Or they might say, hey, I think there's some merit to this paper, but I have some questions. I have some issues that I would like the author or authors to address in a revision. And so this would be called a revise and resubmit, where they sort of send it back to the author and see what they think. And so If it's accepted, obviously it gets accepted. If it's rejected, it gets rejected. If it's revised and resubmitted, basically the paper will go back to the authors. The authors will revise their manuscript and write a response to those reviewers that basically outlines the changes that they made to the manuscript. And then they'll send it back to the editor. The editor will send it back to those reviewers, and it'll continue to go through this process where these reviewers will make these decisions, and it'll keep going through until the reviewers are all satisfied and all recommend acceptance, or it'll at some point in this process get rejected because it's failing to revise the paper adequately or whatever. And this is all the process that will happen at one journal. And so if you sort of go through this process and you go through multiple rounds of reviews, but the paper ends up getting rejected, you might then try sending it to a different journal with a different editor with different reviewers and try to get it published at that journal. And sometimes you'll go through 3, 4, 5 journals before you've sort of revised the paper enough that it actually gets accepted at a journal. So this can take a long time. So, I mean, each round of review can be months and months. Like, I would say an average amount of time would be 3 to 4 months for each round of review to come back. And so this can be a process that ends up taking years and years, particularly if you have to start going to multiple different journals to try and find a home for it. So, I mean, that process probably sounds, I mean, arduous and kind of annoying, but it seems reasonable enough that you're sort of getting experts to weigh in on these papers and decide what they think of these papers, and to only publish it when the paper has sort of reached a high level that it's worth other researchers then sort of seeing in the journal and reading about. But there's a lot of sort of subjective biases that come into play during this process. So it sounds relatively objective, where we're sort of just weighing in on these papers and giving our opinion, but there's lots of ways that subjective biases come into play. And so there are kind of 3 broad categories of bias that occur. There's logistical issues, there's publication bias, and there's researcher bias. And all of these issues are things that have sort of contributed to this replication crisis that we have found ourselves in as psychological researchers. And so the logistical issues come from various aspects of this peer review process, but one is that reviewers are unpaid. So me as a faculty member, I might be asked to review a paper, and yes, I get paid by the university here. I get paid to teach classes and I get paid to do research, but I don't actually get paid to be a reviewer. And so I'm basically just volunteering and sort of giving up my time. And so the amount to which I really put an effort into that review is really up to me, because nobody is really deciding whether or not I've written a good review or not, or an adequate review or not. And in fact, there's very few standards about what a review is supposed to look like, and what should be included in a review, and how the review should be written, and what tone it should be written in. Should it be nice? Should it be mean? Should it be sort of objective? Should it be subjective? So there's really no standards about what's included in those reviews, and reviewers often disagree with each other. So as you noted, we have 2 or 3 reviewers that are reviewing each paper, and they each get to make their own decision. And so it's not uncommon for a paper to come back to an editor where one reviewer said accept, one reviewer said reject, and one reviewer said revise and resubmit. And so then it's up to the editor to kind of figure out what to do with that information. Which reviewer should they listen to, essentially, and what choice should they make? And so there's these logistical issues about just how this process plays out, that's really rooted in this notion that it's all volunteer labor, and there's no clear standards about what is supposed to happen in this process. Then there's also publication bias, which is that journal editors want their journal to be cited. They want other researchers to be reading it. They want researchers to cite that research that they're publishing. And so they only really want to publish new and exciting findings. They want to publish stuff that's really pushing the edge of what we know, and it's really contributing to knowledge in a meaningful way. And the unfortunate reality of that is that studies that sort of say, oh, hey, I did this study on violent video games and aggression, and I found that violent video games don't predict aggression. These studies that find null results typically are not that exciting. They're typically not sort of pushing our knowledge in a new direction. And related to that, replication studies aren't novel. So when we're redoing a study that was done in the past, we're just sort of checking that work. We're not actually kind of designing a new study that's contributing new information. We're really just kind of checking the work of somebody that came before us. And because that kind of work is not novel, and because null results tend to be not very exciting, editors have sort of a bias against those kinds of papers. And so they're less likely to want to send those papers out for review. They're less likely to sort of, I guess, weigh in on the side of the paper when it gets mixed reviews, and that sort of thing. And so it's this unfortunate reality that journals want new and exciting findings, and these studies that say, hey, actually there's nothing to see here, just tend to not be very exciting. Similar to that study that we looked at a couple weeks ago, where they sort of manipulated Doom and saw that, in fact, violence and competition had no effect, or violence and difficulty had no effect on aggression. That study would be much harder to publish than a study that said, hey, yeah, actually, I'm seeing this relationship between violent video games and aggression. And the fact is that researchers know this. Researchers are aware of all these kind of logistical issues and publication biases. And so, in fact, when you conduct a study and you get null results, you'll have less of an incentive to write up that study and send it to a journal, because you know that the deck is stacked against you. Basically, you know that reviewers are going to be less interested in this work, editors are going to be less interested in this work, and so they're not going to want to publish it. And knowing that, given that you might need to get some papers published because you're going up for tenure or whatever it might be, you might then try to make your uninteresting null results seem more exciting. And so you might then start to selectively report studies that work. For example, you might report the version of the competitive reaction time task that suggests there is an effect, and you might ignore the version of the competitive reaction time task that says there's not an effect. So basically, you start trying to rework your results in a way that will make them more exciting to reviewers and editors so that they actually want to send out those results. And one thing that does happen, and it has happened, and we've recognized it happen, is that sometimes researchers just wholly, completely fabricate the results. They make them up. They say they did a study when they never actually did a study, and they'll write a paper based on this data that they've completely fabricated. I should say this is really rare, but it really makes a splash in the headlines when it's found out that it's happening. And so I say rarely, but I do want to say that this is one of these issues that has arisen, and one of the things that have fed into this replication crisis is this realization that some researchers have just wholly made up their work and published on that work for, in some cases, decades. And some people have basically staked their career on these sort of fake results of other researchers without really knowing that those other researchers were faking it. And so all of these sort of issues arising in what appears to be a really objective sort of peer review process. So let's look at a deeper example here. So let's say we have this hypothesis that playing violent video games would increase aggressive behavior. And let's say that we have like 100 researchers out there in the world working on this problem. And let's say 99 researchers conduct their studies and they find no effect of violent video games on aggressive behavior. They've done their studies, they had really high quality studies, and they found no effect. And one of those researchers conducted a study and did find that effect. They did find a relationship between violent video games and aggression, and perhaps they had a sloppy manipulation or their study was less well designed. So what's going to happen here? All of these researchers sort of knowing, if they're not sort of communicating with each other and they're all kind of working on their own, doing these studies on their own, these researchers who found no results are aware of the biases against sort of null results in the peer review process. They know these results aren't very exciting, and they're probably not going to try to publish these results. Whereas that one researcher who does get that significant result knows that kind of result is exciting and is going to send that manuscript out for review. They're going to try to get that published. And the unfortunate thing here is that clearly, if 100 researchers have studied a topic and only one finds an effect and 99 don't, it's really unlikely that that one researcher is right and those 99 researchers are wrong. It's more likely that that one researcher just has kind of a fluky study or a study that was poorly designed, and they found this significant effect. These 99 researchers, on the other hand, sort of have the truth in their hands. And if they were all communicating with each other, they might know that sort of all 99 of us have come to the same conclusion. But unfortunately, the one researcher that's most likely to get published in this situation is the one who found these significant effects. And so this is another problem with that peer review process that leads to this replication crisis, that basically leads to these flukish kind of random chance studies getting published that in fact don't replicate when other people then try to replicate them. Another way of referring to this is that it leads to false positives in the literature. Basically, these studies that have found significant results but don't actually represent the reality of the situation. That in fact, many researchers maybe have been working on the topic, but only the one that got a positive effect is the one that's getting published. And so for a long time, there was really no incentive for researchers to go and try and replicate the work, their own work or the work of others. There was really no incentive structure for us to be trying to replicate results. It was really just about trying to get new, cool, exciting findings published in the research literature. Fortunately, as we as researchers have become more aware of these problems, things have started to change pretty drastically in the last 5 to 10 years. And so I want to say I've been presenting a lot of issues up to this point, and now I want to start hopefully trying to present some solutions about how we've tried to address these problems and sort of start doing better research. So one thing that has happened is that there's large-scale efforts across many research labs to try and replicate classic research. So research labs are less frequently working independently and more often trying to coordinate their efforts together. So those 99 researchers are no longer working by themselves. They're forming sort of teams across different labs and trying to conduct studies simultaneously so that they can start to find out whose findings sort of coordinate with whose, and how frequently do those findings replicate across numerous labs. There's also more interest now on the side of editors and reviewers to publish null results, given that we sort of recognize that null results from high quality studies with high internal and external validity are worth finding out about, and it's worth other researchers finding out about. And so there's a deeper recognition among the academic community that we really should be getting those results out there. We shouldn't be hiding them away just because they're not super exciting, and that in a way null results on their own, especially from well-designed studies, are exciting in their own way. And then a really, really great solution that we've started to try and use is this idea of pre-registering studies. And so what happens here is that you don't wait until you finish the study to submit it to a journal. You actually submit your research idea, your research design to a journal. And it actually then goes through the peer review process based on that design rather than on the results. And so you're actually asking other researchers to critique your research design, and you're getting feedback on that design. And then if it's accepted, if the editor says, hey, if you conduct the study as the reviewers have suggested, we will publish this paper regardless of the results. And that's great, because now it's no longer based on how cool your results are, it's based on how quality your design is. And that's really what should be important when we think about scientific research. It really should be about the quality of the study design rather than about the novelty or the excitement of the results. And so this idea of pre-registering studies, which is becoming more and more common at many journals, is that submit your idea rather than the results. And then once we've accepted the idea, do that study as written, write it up regardless of the results, and we're going to publish it, even if the findings are null, even if the findings are maybe contradictory to what we expected. And so with these ideas in mind, I've assigned some additional materials for you this week. This lecture is meant to kind of serve as a springboard for thinking about these issues in other ways. And so I wanted to give you some other exposures to kind of this issue of replication crises and how research on video games is sort of talked about in the public sphere, given these issues we've identified as researchers. And so the first one is going to be this blog post by Hilgard from 2021. There's also some news clips for you to watch, and there's this chapter by Markey and Ferguson that I'd like you to read. And I just want to give you a brief kind of overview about how I'm thinking about these different materials. So when we're thinking about this kind of recognition that maybe bad studies have been published, or that there's people out there that have fabricated results or made up their results, there's this idea that, when we recognize that that's happened, we should try to get rid of that bad research. We should try to identify it and retract it from the research literature. We should basically remove it and to let people know, hey, don't cite this study. It's based on flawed data, or it's based on a bad study design. We should get rid of it. But in practice, this is actually much more difficult than it sounds. And so I wanted you to read basically this blog post by a researcher named Joe Hilgard, who tried to report academic misconduct that he identified in the realm of violent video game research. And so this blog post, it goes into some ways more detail and statistical information than you might than you might understand. But I think it goes into really the reality of how academics kind of get along with each other and how academics try to communicate with each other, and the obstacles and issues that arise when researchers try to correct the academic record. And so it just goes to show more of these kind of behind the scenes issues that arise in what should be objective processes, but actually have a lot of subjectivity built into them. I then also wanted you to watch a couple news clips about some legal considerations about how violent video game research has been considered in Supreme Court cases. And so in 2011, the Supreme Court heard a case out of California that was trying, where the state was basically trying to regulate the sale of violent video games to minors. And so the Supreme Court was hearing this case that was basically balancing what we had found in social scientific research at the time against First Amendment rights, because basically how the creation of video games and the sale of video games is framed often in legal cases is around the First Amendment. That basically we have the right to create this kind of content, other people have the right to consume that content, and so how do we sort of weigh the potential harm of that content against these First Amendment rights we have of speech, of creating and consuming speech that we would like to consume. And so I have two videos for you to watch that provide some background on that case, as well as some background on the court decision. And it talks through some of the reasoning about the actual use of the social scientific research in those cases and how it was weighed against these First Amendment rights. And so getting into more about how kind of in legalese in the public sphere we sort of talk about this work. And then finally, there's this really cool chapter that I wanted you to read that really pulls these things together, kind of pulls together a lot of the things we've been talking about so far this semester, and sort of discusses these bigger policy issues and these bigger societal issues about how we consider kind of the effects of violent video games and how we think about those effects and respond and react to those effects in both the decisions we make in our lives and the decisions we make as a society. So I really hope that you have some fun and some enjoyment reading this chapter, because I think it does a really, really nice job of providing a good summary of what we've talked about so far.